in Proverbs. We're going to be in chapter 18. As I said last week, Proverbs just kind of jumps from topic to topic. You see some threads going through, but what we want to look at the book of Proverbs through is the lens of an avenue to love God through loving ourselves and loving others. And Proverbs are wisdom literature. It's, even the series is navigating a world of complexity with the wisdom of God. So whatever area of life you're going to look at, you're going to find different nuance, different complexities. Sometimes we want things black and white, and it's just often not. It's often gray. And so how do we navigate the lives that we find ourselves in? And then as a Christian, how do you help others navigate the life they find themselves in? We live in a very individualistic, self-focused world, but the scriptures remind us that we're called to live and love with others. And one of the things that you see through the book of Proverbs is admonition to gain and give wisdom. And if we're to gain and give wisdom, we need to be a good listener. Actually, the book of Proverbs is a letter written from a father to a son, and it's over and over again is listen to my words, listen to my words, listen to my words. And over like 60 times in these 31 chapters, there's this admonition to listen. And if you hadn't noticed, we live in a culture that isn't awesome at listening. I am not awesome at listening. None of us were really good at listening to begin with, and then we added these. I don't even have mine in my pocket because I have to keep it away from me so I can be a better listener. Then we added phones, right? And phones have not made us better listeners, okay? They become distracting, they become challenging. But if you look at it, not listening is one of the primary sources of issues that ail all of us. Not listening causes problems. It causes challenges. Think about in your marriage. There's one kind of pastor or mentor, he was like, I am such a bad listener. He literally had to ask his wife, and like he's a pastor, so we think we have like a bunch of information to give, like, oh, let me just tell you what to do. He would literally ask his wife, do you want me to just listen to you, or are you looking for my help? Like, he needed this clarified before the conversation started, all right? He's like, do you want me just to listen and empathize and listen, or like, do you want like a solution? Because there's a difference in those two things. And so we see this in our marriage. Maybe you get to the end of the day and you're tired and you're exhausted and you just want somebody to what? Listen to you. If you think about parenting, if you've had the joy or pleasure of asking your children to do something that goes one direction, think about asking them to do something while they're on a device. Hey, will you do this? Hey, dinner started. Hey, dinner's ready. Hey, be home at this. And they're like, oh, okay, yeah. And then you're like, no movement, no nothing. And then you're like, did you hear me? Oh, yeah, what did you say? What? They're not listening. They're not engaged. Or the flip side, as parents, we often don't listen so well. So our kids are kind of getting into the teenage years. And what's one of the things that teenagers will say? They're like, you're not listening to me. You just don't understand. We're not taking the time to process and listen to what they're going through. Maybe it's things at work. If you have a boss, or you are a boss, or you have coworkers, one of the challenges that comes from is that we don't listen to one another. And you can just broaden the whole thing out to the world that we live in and in our culture and our world. One kind of communications guru, he said it this way. He said, he did some of these different TED Talks and something like this. He says, a world where we don't listen to each other at all is a very scary place indeed. Julian Treasure, he said, a world where we don't listen to each other at all, which is more where our world is going, right? If I don't agree with you, if we don't have the same views, if we don't have the same background, I am just going to not listen to you at all. It's a very scary place indeed. And then in these TED Talks, he would go through and like give practical ways of actually how to train yourself to listen. One of them was just for 3 minutes a day, sit there and be silent. Like an intentional, just be silent for 3 days, or for 3 minutes. And try that. One of them, he calls it's a practice called savoring. And he said, just go somewhere and listen to some monotonous background noise and just focus on it for a period of time. So he's like, you got the dryer going. Just listen to that dryer going. Or go into a coffee shop or a restaurant and try and pick out one thing and just listen to that one thing amongst all the noise around us. Like, there's actually training for how to listen. So it's not all our fault. We're just born. We're not good at this. And one of the stats is that he said 60% of communication is listening. But the problem is that we only retain 25% of what we hear. So if communication if listening is 60%, we're only hearing 25% of it. I shared this before, but my mom, before she passed away, told Karina, she's like, hey, only tell Brian to do 2 things. Like if you tell him to do 3, he's not going to hear the third, or he's not going to remember what the third thing is. So just go with 2. Right? Good advice. Right? I'm growing, I'm learning. Why? Because we have a hard time listening. But the Proverbs and the Scriptures talk over and over and over again about this call to listen. And what we'll see here is my friend Chan actually wrote a paper called Redemptive Listening. And 2 things we'll see today is that listening is first an act of love. Listening is an act of love. And then listening is an avenue to bring life. Listening is an act of love, and listening is an avenue to bring life. One sampling of Proverbs and this call to listen, Proverbs 18, verse 2 says, a fool takes no pleasure in understanding. A fool takes no pleasure in understanding. In listening, he's saying it's foolish, but only in expressing his opinion. So if you want to be foolish, if you don't want to have a flourishing life, don't listen. Don't seek understanding. Always be ready to just express your opinion. Verse 13 in chapter 18 says, if one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. Anybody else do this? You hear somebody talking, and then you're already thinking about what you're going to say to them before they're even finished talking. Verse 15 in chapter 18 of Proverbs says, an intelligent heart acquires knowledge. An intelligent heart acquires, it listens, it seeks knowledge. And the ear of the wise seeks knowledge. The ear of the wise. If you want to be wise, if you want to gain wisdom and give wisdom, you have to listen. You have to seek knowledge. And then the New Testament book of James is a wisdom literature as well. And this is probably a more famous verse that you've heard, but James 1:19 says, know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear and slow to speak and slow to anger. And we just reverse this all the time, right? We're quick to speak and we're slow to hear. It's the propensity of our hearts. But for us to be a loving people and a loving community, we need to cultivate this skill of listening. Some of this was triggered through the men's study we're doing on Thursday morning in the Gospel of Life and talking about James 1:19. They said one of the easiest ways to practice and show warmth, one of the easiest ways to love somebody else is to listen very attentively to others rather than being quick to talk. That's what James is saying. One of the easiest ways to show love, to show warmth, is just to simply listen to somebody. That was our first point. Listening is an act of love. There's a famous book Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote called Life Together, and he's smart, man. And he packed into 3 paragraphs more than like most people pack in an entire book. And there's 3 paragraphs. Some have entitled simply the ministry of listening. And I'll post it online. I'll send it to you guys. But it's just super helpful. But he talks about that listening is actually ministry. It's actually ministering to other people. It's a call that God gives us. And Bonhoeffer says the first service that one owes to others in the fellowship or in the church consists in listening to them. The first service. The first way we can love and serve others is to simply listen to them. He says, just as love to God begins with listening to his word, so the beginning of love for the brethren is learning to listen to them. Listening can be a greater service than speaking. We need to stop and listen to that and think about that. Listening can be a better and greater service than speaking. right? I won't include you in this. I always think I need to tell somebody what to do, how to feel, how to fix something. And it's not always helpful. There's a call to just listen because it's an act of love. And what did Jesus tell us to do? Love God and love others. Listening is an act of love. In Philippians 2, Paul's encouragement to have what he says, have the mindset of Christ. He says, if you have any comfort in love, he says it flows from a humble heart that, one, counts others more significant than yourself. You know what listening does? It counts somebody else more significant than you. I want to know about you. I want to hear how you are. I want to know you. One of our mission, our values that we have is that we want to know God. God wants to know us. That happens through listening. We count others more significant than ourselves. Verse 4 in Philippians 2 goes on and says, look not only to his own interest. I talked about this last week, that we will continually look to our own interest, but also to the interest of others. How do we look towards the interest of others? We listen to them. Verse 7 says in Philippians 2 that he emptied himself, that he took on the form of a servant. We can embody, we can model, we can become like Christ simply through listening. Oftentimes we think we need to do magnificent and great things for God. And God does want to, and Brandon preached on this a few weeks ago, God will do greater things through you. But we always think that's big and showy and about us. And Jesus is saying, like, no, that can come through listening. Listening to somebody that needs to be heard, somebody that needs to be loved, somebody that needs to be cared for. Listening affirms people. When you listen to somebody, you're not accepting everything they're saying. They could be saying stuff that's completely wrong and false, but when you listen to them, you're affirming them. There's a helpful article by a missionary named Janet Dunn, and she says, when we listen, we invite another person to exist. When we listen, we invite another person to exist. Again, maybe it's the end of the day. And maybe you've been busy at work and you've been talking all day and people have been talking at you all day. Right? And maybe your spouse has been all day not having an adult conversation, or maybe it's somebody that is like a neighbor that is alone all day because they don't have anybody with them. And then you're kind of like trying to take the trash out, and then you see them and you're like, oh man, I'm tired. I don't have time for this. I'm trying to get back in as quick as possible. Like, wait. Just simply listening to them invites them to exist. Maybe it's a kid in the back of the car who just wants to what? Talk. And talk some more. And talk some more. And talk some more. Listening to them is an act of love. It affirms their existence. And what we see throughout the Gospels and the New Testament is that Jesus was the master listener. He was the master listener. Just do a cursory read through the Gospels and watch all the times that Jesus listened to people. In John 4, Jesus was tired. It says he was wearied and he was sitting by the well, and it was the middle of the day. And the Samaritan woman comes in the middle of the day. Why? Because there was nobody else there. And what does Jesus do in his tiredness? He listens to her. He asks her questions. He wants to know her. A couple Palm Sundays ago, we preached Mark 10, and there was a blind man by the side of the road. And the crowd's telling him, and he's yelling out for Jesus, 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 have mercy on me. And everybody's telling him to be silent, to shut up, to go back to not existing. But then it says that Jesus heard him, and he called him, and he asked him. He says, what do you want? What do you need? Jesus took a non-existing person and made him exist. In the midst of noise and yelling and chaos and going to the cross. He was marching to the cross to die for the sins of the world. That's what was happening 5 days from then. He knew what was happening. What does he do? He heard him. And he invited him to exist. But the opposite is also true. Bonhoeffer went on in his 3 powerful little paragraphs and said, there is a kind of listening, an impatient, inattentive listening that despises the brother and is only waiting for a chance to speak and thus get rid of the other person. Like when I read that, I was like, oh, that sounds really harsh. And sometimes we need to hear things really harsh because that also sounds very convicting. Right? Does anybody else do this? Like, how can I get this conversation to be over? How can I wait to get my word in? How can I express my opinion? It's true. But the scriptures remind us that this act of listening is an act of love. Dane Ortland, he had a helpful article on listening and this biblical view of listening. And he says that listening is to shift your focus from self to another, to step into their reality, to bear their life with them. Again, we don't always have to give somebody an answer or fix anything. Sometimes people just need to know, like, hey, I'm going through this. It's really hard. It's really confusing. It's really boring. It's really whatever. And through listening, you bear their life with them. It is fundamentally love. That's what love does. I love this. He says, Christians of all people should be famous for their spouting off their opinions, yelling at the world, telling everybody what's wrong with each other. No. Christians should be famous for listening. Is that what Christians are famous for in our world, in our culture? It's a great vision. If love is the defining mark of Christians, shouldn't listening be a fundamental mark of how we interact with others? How much better would our world be if Christians modeled how to listen? I'm not saying agree with everybody, but just listen and understand and empathize. It's an act of love. So real practically, how do we do this? Because again, that pastor's not the only one that needs help with this. I need help with this, and y'all know me well enough to know that I need help with this. So how do we become better listeners? First, you can just empathize with people. There's a call to empathize, to just seek to understand and let them know you know what they're going through is difficult, is challenging. Right, I had Marshall and I were literally talking about this last Sunday, and then I did it this week. I was going on a bike ride and brought Weston, our youngest one, and so there's like the sandy area, and like I was like, let me go through that, and I'll come back. And he's like, no, Dad, I want to like go the whole way. I don't want to like not go as far as you. So I was like, okay, you go. I'll just kind of wait here and go. So I tried to like turn around, but I put the wrong foot down, so I was like barely moving, and it just went and just smacked, like just fell like 6 feet down. And what I found out was like, this really hurts. And it's not just because I'm 46, it's just flat out hurts. Like when you fall on concrete. Now, usually when I would take my kids mountain biking, or they've had some pretty bad falls, and my parenting approach often is like, scrub it off, get on the bike, and let's go, right? I was not good at empathizing with them. Like I wasn't a complete jerk about it, but like, you know, like sort of like scrape it off, let's go. Like me falling allows me to empathize more with what's going on with them. That's part of listening, to empathize, to bear their life with them. To just say like, man, I can't imagine. That sounds really hard. Another way you can be a better listener is to ask them to expound on what they're talking about. Simple questions like, just tell me more. Like, well, what happened next? How did it do? And the third way is just to explore. Explore what happened to them. How did that make you feel? What was that like for you? How did that end up? This Julian Treasure, communications guru, has a little thing, he called it RASA. It's R-A-S-A. And it's a way to listen better. He said the R is to receive the information, appreciate, again, sort of like empathize, appreciate, summarize, so like, hey, so what you're telling me is this, and then ask follow-up questions. So receive, appreciate, summarize, and ask. Again, listening is something that we need to learn and develop and to grow in. Because it's an act of love. And Jesus calls us to love one another. And so we need to ask, who has God placed around us that we can love through listening? Who needs to be heard? Who needs to know they exist? I mean, part of that prayer, like Corinne and I were talking about it, like I was like, well, that sounds like kind of rough, but it's also true because I know there's a lot of poor, I know there's a lot of hurting, I know there's a lot of needy that I just disregard because I'm busy and I got kids and I'm doing stuff, right? Who needs to be heard? Who is voiceless? Who functions in our world like they don't exist? Where do we need to repent of not listening or having inattentive listening? How do we grow as listeners? And so listening is an act of love, but it also is an avenue to bring life. Listening is an avenue to bring life. Bonhoeffer, in this paragraph, said, we should listen with the ears of God, so we can empathize like God and understand like God and think like God, that we may speak the word of God. So quite often that we do just listen to listen, and that's it. We're just going to listen. But other times, listening readies us to minister words of grace where people need it. Dave Mathis said that. He said, other times we listen to it readies us to minister words of grace where people need it. But we don't know where people need it if we don't listen to them. Think about Jesus with his friend Lazarus died. I use this in sermons. And the two sisters, Lazarus' two sisters, they both come to Jesus. And they both literally tell him the same thing. They said, if you would have been here, this wouldn't have happened. But Jesus looks at them both and he responds to them differently. With Mary, who was weeping and who was crying, Jesus didn't listen to her words, he listened to her body. He listened to her emotions. He listened to what was going on with them. And it says that he just simply wept. He wept with her. He didn't say anything. Jesus wept. He also noticed his sister Martha, who said the same things, and there was anger in her voice. She was angry at Jesus because her brother had died, and he was saying, if you would have been here, this wouldn't have happened. And Jesus heard her, but then he spoke. And he says, Martha, don't you know? I am the resurrection and the life. He saw her brokenness. He saw her need. He saw where she was lacking hope. And he heard her. And he spoke truth into her need. Proverbs 23, verse 11 says, like apples of gold in settings of silver is a word spoken in right circumstances. Like apples of gold and settings of silver, whatever that means, that's fancy, that's good, is a word spoken in right circumstances. How do we know right circumstances? How do we know the words to speak? We have to listen. But those words bring life. Proverbs 20, verse 5 says, the purposes of a man's heart are deep waters, but a man of understanding draws them out. When the scriptures talk about deep waters, it talks about deception and darkness. It says that a man's heart can be deep and dark and manipulative. But a man of understanding can listen to somebody else and where they're being deceived and where there's darkness in their life. And he can draw out through his listening how he can untangle their lives for them and speak truth and wisdom into them and bring life through their listening. And we have these opportunities all day. I've mentioned Chan, one of my mentors, pastor down in Fort Lauderdale. He's got this paper he calls Redemptive Listening. And in it he said, within everyday conversations, we have windows of opportunities to shine the light of the gospel, the good news, the truth of who Jesus is and his word into people's lives if we would just listen to them. Within these daily conversations, people reveal both their hopes and dreams as well as their frustrations they face in life. So it's through everyday conversation and everyday life, as you're paying attention, as you're listening, that you get to understand people's hopes and dreams and their aspirations for life, and also their fears and failures and where they are struggling. One of the most helpful little books I read in seminary is called The Pastor as a Minor Poet. And he says, nobody's going to come out and just tell you what's wrong with them. He's like, your job is to always look beneath the surface, to ask questions, say, hey, what's going on underneath the water? Everybody's swimming around like little ducks, right? We live in Jupiter. Everything looks awesome, right? And everybody's doing what? It's like complete chaos under the water, right? The role that we have as ministers of the gospel is to look underneath the water, to ask the question, to see what's going on in the restlessness of their hearts, and remind them and speak the truth of who God is and what he's done for them and the life that he promises to them. There's a redemptive retelling. And we need to think about this as we look at people, as we look out in our world and we see people who are struggling with their sexuality. Or maybe there's parents who are struggling with disappointment of their children. People who are going through frustration and struggles with work. These are all things that people are just kicking their little feet under the water. There's people are struggling with these things, having a hard thing. They're trying to untangle these things. And as ministers of the gospel, we can hear their words, we can hear their struggles, we can ask questions, and we can retell and help them better understand their story in light of who God is. One of Karina's favorite, she's amazing at this, like many things, but is one of her passions in life is to help people understand and connect their story to God's story. If you've ever had a conversation with her, like that's what she does. She listens, she empathizes, she explores, and then she helps people understand the things they're going through in light of God's greater story. All this points us to our need for what I call just the great listener. Our inability, our challenge to listen, just even listen, reveals a deeper problem. It reveals a deeper need. That we have to learn to listen, should throw off some little lights on the panel. The tendency, our tendency is to shift from others to ourselves. That can be the propensity of our heart outside of Christ. We were, I'm like, this is definitely going to end up in the sermon. So we were swimming yesterday. They had a party, and we're going for triathlon number 2. So this time I was like, oh, this would be a good idea to actually train for this triathlon. And so Robbie and Marshall and I, we went and swam laps. And they have, the pool it's 25 yards. And so you swim back and forth. But they also can run it the other way, and it's 50 yards. And so that can actually make you train better and harder. So we asked the lifeguard, hey, do they ever set these things? Let me rephrase this. Marshall and Robbie asked the lifeguard, do these things ever go 50 yards? Like, I don't need to go 50 yards. 25 is plenty for me. I need the wall. Okay? And he's like, we rarely do that. And we're like, well, like, why? And he's like, because it only produces 7 lanes and people won't share. And we're like, what do you mean? And he's like, yeah, we've had to call the police because people would not share their lane. They are so focused on themselves that, 50 yards is a long way. They won't be in the same lane of a pool with another person. Okay? That sounds drastic and dramatic, but that can be the propensity of our hearts. It is about us. And it's one of our problems with why we don't listen. And our need for the gospel begins with our not listening to God. Ortland highlighted that the word obey, which is over and over and over in the gospel, simply means to listen to the voice of. To obey is to listen to the voice of. And to not obey is to not listen to the voice of. And this is what happened in the garden with Adam and Eve. They did not listen to the voice of God. They listened to the voice of the serpent. There was a God who they heard from, who promised them life, and promised them flourishing, and promised them healthy relationships, and a healthy soul. He says, if you don't listen, if you don't trust, if you don't follow, it will lead to death and destruction and disintegration. And Adam and Eve focused on themselves. They listened to themselves. And it led to not listening to one another. They're blaming each other for this problem, and it fractured their relationship, and it fractured their relationship with God. And death and disintegration had entered our world. If everyone want to know what's wrong, go back there. But the good news is that God didn't withdraw from them. God moved towards them. God literally asked them a question. He asked them, where are you? I'm like, God, we heard your voice and we hid. They hid from the voice of life. They hid from the voice of love. He says, who told you that? Who told you you were naked? God listened to them. He asked them. He listened to them. And he didn't just listen. He moved towards them. This is what God does. He continually calls and pursues and invites us to experience his life and love. And it ultimately comes in Jesus. Philippians 2, which I read earlier, continued, where I said he emptied himself. Jesus took the form of a servant. Jesus was born in the likeness of men. It says, and be found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Jesus listened to our greatest need. He saw the darkness, the disintegration, the isolation, the loneliness in our lives. And he pursues us. And he comes after us. And he gave us his life so we might have true life. It says, therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name. On the cross, we see the Father. He doesn't listen to the Son. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Right? Jesus is cut off from this communication, from this relationship with the Father. And he's cut off so we can be brought in. So we can be heard. So we can be restored. So we can hear from and talk to the Father. It says that Jesus is interceding for us right now. He hears our voice. He hears our prayers. Knowing God as the great listener, allows us to draw near to him. It allows us to experience life. It allows us to experience love in and through him. And when we know that love, when we know that life, we can actually communicate what we're struggling with. It frees us. We're accepted. We're loved by the Father. So we can be honest about the hard things. But it also allows us to allow others to draw near to us. If we're going to the Father, we have space, we have capacity to hear from others. Right? Because it doesn't have to be all about us. We have the Father listening to us. It allows us to allow others to confide in us, to experience love, to experience life through us. We need to know God as the great listener. He hears us. And then we become like him. We become listeners like the Father. And people experience love. And we can bring words of life. Let's pray.